I've already played 100 hours of Last Epoch after it launched and around 140 hours before that, and in this video we're not only going to review the entire game as it is right now, but also give a little bit of insight what was before and hopefully what will happen eventually. And also obviously we will answer the question if you should also spend 35 bucks and maybe if you should also spend 100 hours or more playing Last Epoch. Here we go. So first of all, I'm gonna show you what I've done in the 100 hours really quickly. So this was my main character, which was a Beastmaster, a build that I made myself. It's a crow build, and it was actually very good. So I made a couple of videos about that as well. Very fun build, and I got the character all the way to level 100. Basically cleared the entire game besides like 1 or 2 bosses. But I've tried all of them, or attempted them at least. At the very end game, it's kind of hard to keep the minions alive or the crows alive, so I struggled a little bit on tier 4 Julra, but outside of that, we got to like a little bit over 200 corruption, done all of that. I've also made an avalanche build right here. I'm currently working on a thorn totem build. I also made a druid who's naked because it was a complete failure, that build. But I'm one of those people who just wants to make their own builds, so, you know, I had to try it. It didn't work. Move on. Also, I will show you real quick what I did before, because I already had 140 hours before the game actually launched. So I played a bunch of different characters just to try it out. It was also like a crow build back in the day. I played a little bit of a druid thing. This was a spellblade, I think. Then we have I mean, it says right there, I'm blind. We also have another primalist. We have a level 77 sorcerer, also a forge guard. This was actually my very first high level, well, monolith level character that I've ever made. I also made a warpath character once, but that was all before the game launched. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the current version of the game. Obviously we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the server issues that happened immediately after launch, and they're still kind of going on. The loading screens are still all over the place, and it's been, you know, an experience to say the least. I'll just log in real quick, and I'll basically, you know what, we'll talk about the positives first, and then we'll get into the negatives, and then at the very end there will be, well, there's obviously always timestamps in these videos, and there will also be a complete review and the scoring at the end of the video, so tune in for that one as well. Anyways, so let's talk about the positives, and my favorite thing about this entire game probably, which is the skill trees. Every ability in Last Epoch has its own individual skill tree, which you level up, you know, through just playing the game. And it's actually incredibly nice. Even in the leveling phase, end game, it still feels good. There's so many different options you can do. For example, this thorn totem you can make into a cold totem. You can make it only shoot a single projectile, but that one can pierce. You can summon a lot of totems at the same time. You can make the thorn totem shots home to their targets, so the projectiles are homing to the targets. You can make a poison build with this. There's a bunch of different things that you can set up through just the skill trees. Okay, the skill trees, crazy, right? And there's 5 you can actually choose, which means it's not like a lot of other games where you only want to play one single ability, although you can do that here as well. Obviously, multiplicative scaling, having a lot of abilities buff your main ability is very strong, but it's not necessarily the only way you can play the game. There's a bunch of builds that also utilize multiple different abilities and you know, make all of them relatively strong, right? So first of all, the skill trees, probably the best skill trees in the entire genre, and that's also only the skill trees. There's also your class skill trees, which are also very interesting. There's a lot of depth in here, and it's super fun. Like, if you were someone who likes to make their own builds, I would highly recommend playing Last Epoch, because this game has such a massive advantage to even Path of Exile that you can jump in as a novice and learn while you go. It's intuitive, and that's something that a lot of ARPGs, and especially Path of Exile, have a problem with. I don't want to sit in a simulation third-party tool and like you know, think about everything there and simulate how much damage I do and all these kind of things. You need a PhD in every single stat in the game to even understand what's happening. This game gives you much more of an intuitive approach. Obviously, there's still a lot of min-maxing regardless, and obviously if you would want to super giga maximize every piece of damage there is, a simulation tool would probably also help. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're not someone who likes to watch guides, like me, then you can easily just jump into Last Epoch right now and make your own builds. Although they're probably gonna suck in the beginning, you can still do it and learn while you go. It feels intuitive. My favorite part about the game. Let's talk about the crafting, which is in my opinion also one of the best features of Last Epoch. And if we just go over here and put my item in here, this has a little bit of forging potential left, although it doesn't really matter. There's so many different ways we can adjust this item, although everything is already maxed out here. I'll just show you a couple of examples. I could, for example, shatter the item and get all of these affix shards back, although it's a little bit of an RNG amount. We could also just say, I want specific amounts of shards, or remove a specific mod off the item. So I could use a rune of removal. Or we could even upgrade the item into a unique item, which is RNG which one it is, but it will be one of those base types, so it will be a scepter. I could just upgrade it into a unique and see where it goes, and see maybe there's a unique that I want here, and I can just make it into one. There's so many different like features like that, and you can really pinpoint what you want to do. This is obviously not a forging guide and a crafting guide, so I will leave it at that. But the baseline is the crafting in this game is very intuitive. Even while leveling, you can figure it out slowly. There's a couple of different things that you need to be aware of, and how things work, how implicits work, how suffixes work. You know, all of these kind of things come to you like slowly, but just by playing the game. So one step at a time, and you will learn these things organically again. You don't really need a guide to understand how this works, although the higher you go, the more intricate the system becomes. So there's also a lot of depth to be had, and that's probably the most positive thing I can say about Last Epoch in general, is the game allows for complexity with accessible like first steps, you know? So you can just play the game, you will kind of understand how things work, but there's still a lot of complexity to be had in the later stages of the game. So it's a great, overall, that's probably the name of the entire game. Accessibility while keeping complexity alive at higher levels. Also, something that I really enjoy in comparison to games like Path of Exile is there's very few checklist stats. And what I mean by that is, there's no accuracy rating, so you don't have to hit this very specific threshold to always hit your abilities. Even the resistances, while very important, aren't as multiplicative in their damage, so you don't necessarily even have to max them out. So it's also a little bit less of a checklist there, and overall that it just feels like there's a little bit more thought put into, like, oh, is this a fun stat, or is this stat just a remnant of the past, you know? So also something that Last Epoch does very well is thinking about ARPGs in general and what systems are even required to make it fun. And also, in a way, they're doing something that is quite interesting also with the filters. Let's talk about that real quick. Because ARPGs obviously have so much loot, they were like, maybe we should just make a loot filter in-game. You know, you can just make a loot filter in-game. It's very organic too. And look at this. This is my end-game loot filter. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But you can make a very simple but very effective loot filter without really much effort at all. Just understanding the basics, how things work. And you will learn those things just by playing the game. Again, very great that these things are in the game, that a loot filter is in the game, how everything works. It's just very, very nice. And just one more thing about the crafting system. If maybe you've seen my 2 red items here, these are actually uniques, just like the ones here, but I will compare these two real quick for you. So basically, this is the normal Arthur's Legacy unique helmet. And again, Last Epoch was like, dropping endgame, like uniques later on in the game, in a lot of ARPGs isn't that interesting, because the rare items just scale better in a lot of cases. So what did they do? They made it so that you can actually craft onto your unique items. With a very specific system, your unique items need something called legendary potential, just like other items need forging potential. And those items then can inherit stats from rare items, meaning you can kind of get a lot of the scaling from exalted items, which are these purple ones, and put them onto a unique, basically introducing a very interesting end game, like unique upgrading system, which makes it so that uniques are, technically speaking, one of the best, if not the best, items in the game. So unlike a lot of other games where you're in endgame, you're like finding a unique and you're like, oh, whatever, no one wants any of these uniques anyways. If you get a unique with a high legendary potential, you can make it into some crazy item. So for me, in this case, my Archer's Legacy, I put on 7 strength because I need it for my build, and more spell damage for my Stormcrows, which makes it incredibly strong. So you have like this additional system on top of having uniques, which allows you to have a little more endgame depth and also keeping uniques relevant. Even my axe here is a level 27 axe that I require to make my build work, and the axe on its own would be really bad for my build though. So I found one with 2 legendary power potential and put some stats on it that I actually need. Very nice system, super smart way to make uniques relevant even in the later stages of the game. Even the monoliths, which is kind of the end game system for mapping, which I'm in right now, and yeah, there's a lot of things to do even in end game, and that's kind of the only reason I even got to level 100. But I will say there's a lot more things that they need to add. Monoliths in general are much more fun than they were before, but there's still a lot of things they need to add to make them more interesting long term. And one of those things would be bosses and stuff like that, which they are working on, but there's not a whole lot of that in the game right now. So a lot of the end game systems seem a little bit bare bones and a little bit, well, requiring more effort and more time to be put in. But overall speaking, it's actually overall a really nice system already, and over time this will just get better. So they have a good baseline here that they can use, but there's just more to be had. So here's the monolith system. You can see there's basically little maps everywhere. You progress the monoliths. This is a little bit of a lower level one, and you can then fight bosses. You can just progress this further and further, and the more corruption you have in the top left, the more loot you get, although I've heard there's a couple of bugs about that, but overall you can keep progressing almost forever in these. There's also dungeons to be had. So if we go to my stash real quick, all of these keys, this is a Soulfire Bastion key, a Lightless Arbor key, an Arena key, and also a Temporal Sanctum key. So there's 4 dungeons at the moment as well that you can access with these keys. And, well, those dungeons have very unique systems to them. The Temporal Sanctum is used to actually craft the legendary potential on my items that I just mentioned. The Soulfire Bastion is kind of a gambling dungeon. The Lightless Arbor one is where you spend a lot of your gold to get a lot of rewards. And the Arena is kind of a ladder system, actually, where when you go over here, it's always loading for a little while. But there's already a ranking system for the Arena, where you can sort after normal, hardcore, you know, one player or solo self-found player, which class, and so on. So there's already a ranking system behind that. So all of these 4 dungeons already have their own little niches. But again, I think the end game is still suffering a lot from not having a lot of aspirational content. So they definitely need to put a lot more effort into that. But again, the base that they have, the foundation that they have is really fucking good. And just by keep pushing more things out, producing more end game content, producing actual bosses and stuff like that, the game will already become much better. And that kind of leads me to a couple of the negative points already, which there are a bunch as well, so don't get me wrong. I think the game is in a very good state right now, but there's still a lot of things that need to be ironed out. So first of all, as I already said, there's a lot of end game aspirational content still missing. There's a lot of little events missing in Monoliths. You know how PoE has a lot of league mechanics that kind of change how the maps work all the time. Those kind of things aren't in the game yet. It's still a little bit lackluster on that front. And that kind of ties into the item problems as well. A lot of people are complaining about how the items work right now and what kind of archetypes there are for unique items, especially. Just me, for example, in my opinion, I see a lot of necrotic items, a lot of minion necrotic items maybe even. And there's not that many uniques and other like interesting items for other archetypes. There's obviously exceptions, and usually the newer classes have some cooler shit, but there's a lot of abilities and archetypes within classes that aren't very well supported yet, and therefore they're just weaker than others. So that, in that sense, again, this is one of those things where they just need more time. They need to implement more items. There needs to be more things for it to be more interesting. Also, we can talk about their very unique trade system yet. Speaking of which, I sold 2 items. Let's get those really quick. So there's a couple of things that we have to talk about here. Oh, I sold one for 1 mil, nice. There's a couple things we have to talk about here. First of all, as you can see already on the screen, there's a bunch of different vendors. So it doesn't work like a traditional auction house. I mean, it's called the bazaar anyways, but you have to go to every specific vendor to get those specific items, which is super fucking annoying. And yeah, it's not a good time. And also there's a bunch of other problems. So basically, I'm right now in one of the stalls here, which is a one-handed axe one, and I would love to compare the weapon to the one that is in my inventory. How do I do that? I cannot even open the inventory while I'm in the bazaar. Looking through the bazaar is also kind of annoying because it's menus on top of menus on top of menus. There's no real search function, so you always have to go through the menus as well. It's very hard to compare the different items. It's just very, very annoying to use this trading system. There's a different system as well called the Circle of Fortune or something, where you basically solo sell-found and you get much more items on your own without being able to trade, which is, I think, what most people are gravitating to right now, because again, this entire trading part, the bazaar, is kind of annoying to use. So a lot of people are gravitating to not trading at all at the moment. So just to go back a little bit to the monoliths, which is the endgame mapping system of Last Epoch, these ones have a lot of depth to them, and they give you a bunch of rewards as well, so it's very interesting. But there's also a lot of problems in them. Some of them are super laggy. That might also be a little bit server related, but I don't think it is. Some of them are very laggy. Some of them are janky. Even just picking up your trade items can be very laggy at times. So there's still a lot of polishing to be done. At some point, also the combat, you know, when there's like little slopes like this where you walk upwards or downwards, it can feel very janky, and it's like kind of lagging you out. And there's like, even sometimes in boss fights, there's these very buggy situations where you get hit by something that shouldn't hit you, or you pressed a button and it didn't work. I literally pressed the button, mate. What? It bugged, man. I was lagging in Leap Slam, which is an iframe, but it didn't work because it lagged. Still a lot of jank in this game. It's still an indie game in that sense, but again, those are all things that can be fixed, and I'm very optimistic that they will fix it. And that brings us to the actual scoring of the game, and if you should be spending 35 bucks in 100 hours as well. So in this tier list, a couple of warnings. First of all, I actually use all of the points from 0 to 10 to rate my games. So a 5 out of 10 is not a dog shit game. A 5 out of 10 is okay. Just read what's below the numbers, basically. And also, I would say everything above a 5 I would recommend. Like a 5 out of 10 basically means a game has very niche strengths, and I would only recommend them to very specific people that are looking for those type of niche experiences. So right now I would put Last Epoch at a 6 out of 10. I think it's in a very decent spot. Just for comparison, I think Diablo 4, although in my previous review I said it's a 4.5, that was too generous. Diablo 4 was a 3 out of 10. It was a pretty bad game. D for bad, by the way. And also we have Path of Exile for a little bit more context. I have around 500 hours in Path of Exile, and I put it in 7. I'll explain that really quick as well, because obviously a lot of people are Path of Exile players. I think Path of Exile is probably a 9 out of 10 for veteran players who are really invested in the game and understand the systems. For new players, Path of Exile is like a 4 or 5. It's complete dog shit. It's very hard to get into, and it's a very miserable experience. At least it was for me when I first got into it, because I'm someone that doesn't like watching guides or anything. So playing Path of Exile without third-party help is very miserable in my opinion. I hope Path of Exile 2 will fix that, but I do understand that Path of Exile is one of the best, if not the best ARPG ever made when it in terms of complexity, depth, and even build making depth. I think Path of Exile is insane. But because it's so bad for the new players and even the intermediate players, I think I will put it at a 7. How does Last Epoch rank in that equation? I actually think Last Epoch is surprisingly close to Path of Exile already. Now, I've already played Last Epoch before it even came out, for around 140 hours, and I think before the 1.0 launch, Last Epoch was actually a 5 out of 10. So just in this one patch, it already jumped up one spot, and I think it has the potential to go much higher than that. I actually think Last Epoch has so good fundamentals that it has a chance to overtake Path of Exile even. It's not quite there yet. There's still a lot of things that need to be ironed out, from bug fixes, from server issues, from lack of itemization, from lack of bosses. There needs to be just more, okay? It's a new game. Path of Exile obviously has plenty of years of development time ahead of Last Epoch right now, so it makes sense that Last Epoch has less content. But to answer the question, would I recommend Last Epoch for 100 hours, and would I recommend you buying the game? Absolutely. You will buy the game once and you can play it forever anyways. It's 35 bucks, which is half the price of Diablo 4, and it's twice as good as Diablo 4 already. Again, I think Last Epoch is probably the most promising new ARPG that has come out in the recent years, and it's also one that has a lot of potential to go even further. That being said, also, I prefer Last Epoch over Path of Exile, personally. But Path of Exile just has so many more years ahead of Last Epoch and has just way better endgame systems, has way more complexity in the long term, and I'm sure if once Path of Exile 2 comes out, it will get even crazier than that. So that being said, Last Epoch, 6 out of 10, amazing for new players, amazing for mid-level players, and it lacks a little bit of the endgame player front. Path of Exile is kind of the opposite, where it's really bad for new players, pretty bad still for intermediate players, but absolutely outstanding for veteran players. So that being said, I think Last Epoch has the chance to pull up to Path of Exile and say, we are doing a lot of things a lot better than you, and maybe eventually they can overtake them. That being said, Path of Exile 2 is on the horizon, so maybe they will take some lessons from Last Epoch and implement them in their game, and I can absolutely see Path of Exile 2 blowing Last Epoch out of the water. But we will see about that. There will probably be a separate review about Path of Exile 2 as well, and we'll see how good it actually is. So yeah, Last Epoch, 6 out of 10, amazing game for an indie studio that started on from a Reddit post. I think this is kind of the only game like that that has really succeeded in this way. And if they keep making the servers better, the combat, the floatiness of the game, they keep making more items, more boss fights, just more Last Epoch, and I think it can slowly catch up to Path of Exile. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. The game has a lot of potential, and I will probably keep covering the game in the future as well, because I enjoy it. I think it's a great game. Well, it's a decent game right now, but it will become a great game eventually. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks for hanging out. Don't forget to subscribe if you like these kind of videos. There's a couple of other 100-hour reviews I've already done. Not all of them on the list, but yeah. Thank you for hanging out, guys. See you in the next one, and bye-bye. Peace.